One thing that was important to me in putting this together was to combine, to have some perspective about the NFL that perhaps others haven't. I think as someone who covers the NFL business, it invites a lot of discussion, both good and bad, both negative and positive. And frankly, it's been the year of constant focus on the NFL's credibility, on the NFL's integrity in what's happened. I think in some ways we kind of have this line in the sand in looking at the NFL pre-September 8th, 2014 and post, because that was the day of the elevator video with Ray Rice. And I think so much has changed in that world since that went viral. So all of us up here have had a role in commenting, analyzing, or affecting change in the case of Cynthia Hogan since that time. So I thought we'd have some leading voices that have been analyzing this, that have looked at it from a perspective that I think is unique, and can really comment with some informed, educated, and enlightened perspective. So flanking our guest in the center are two colleagues of mine that I have tremendous respect for who work at ESPN, Jane McManus and Ashely Fox. And in the center, a new hire, relatively new, in September, the Senior Vice President for Public Policy and Government Affairs, Cynthia Hogan with the NFL. Let's welcome them. And Cynthia, we'll start with you. That's me. Hired the same week that I just talked about. And I'm going to ask you right away. Coincidence? And what were you brought on to do? What did you leave government service to come to the NFL and do?
I thought you were going to ask, what were you thinking?
Right, and that's, what were you thinking? Can everyone hear Cynthia? Okay.
How about now? There we go. Well, I would have to say it wasn't a coincidence in that it wasn't something that happened, the final event that I joined the league happened that week, but of course hiring someone is a long process these days, and the league had first reached out to me early in the summer, really before the Ray Rice incident was on the headlines or the radar screen. I left government because I had had a fantastic and wonderful experience in Washington. I worked in the Congress, I worked for the White House. I had had an amazing opportunity to work on issues of public policy across a wide variety of issues, but a number of them related to sensitive cultural issues. Way back in the early 90s, I was at the Senate Judiciary Committee when we held the first hearings the federal government ever held on issues of family violence and violence against women, and was able to help write the Violence Against Women Act and get it passed almost 21 years ago now. And kind of came full circle. Then at the White House, we did the reauthorization of the Violence Against Women Act while I was there, and I worked on any number of other things. So I think the coincidence in my coming to the league in September is that I had had this history in working with issues around violence against women. I never worked in the field. It was always at the policy level. I don't like to overstate kind of how on the front lines I was. I have unbelievable admiration for the people who work on the front lines in this space. But I knew a fair amount about their work and about the way they understood these issues from having spent years talking to them. And so when I got to the league, and I told the two of you this earlier, I had a little bit different perspective than everybody who was there that week in this very tense time. My attitude a little was like, I've been trying to get people to pay this much attention to violence against women for 25 years. This is great. Exactly. And I would say the commissioner was a little bit like, well, I'm going to try and get that perspective. But I actually think the league has gotten that perspective. Of course, no one is ever happy to have such public attention brought to mistakes that they've made, whether it's individuals or organizations. But I think that and this is something I tell my own teenagers, everyone's going to make mistakes. The way you want to be measured is how you respond when you've made a big mistake. And what I was excited about in getting to the league that week and in the work that we've been able to do since then is the response. I think the response has been pretty overwhelming, pretty focused, but also pretty broad. We've attached a lot of resources, and both in terms of people thinking about it, but also other resources to figuring out how the league can be a positive force on this issue. We brought this on ourselves, but we want to make sure that the difference that we make in the end is one that's positive. I can, go through a bunch of the things that we've done, but I will leave that maybe for some follow-up questions.
Okay, when we will. Jane, we were doing a lot on what the response was, what Cynthia's talking about. How reactive, how responsive to public pressure, in your view? What went on since, again, this watershed time in early September that you were and are critical of and were and are praiseworthy of?
Well, I think when you look back at kind of the arc of events, there were a lot of people, myself included, who thought that the first video was enough to be horrified by.
Right.
That you really didn't need a second video to show how she became unconscious, the fact that she became unconscious. As Judge Barbara Jones said in her decision to reinstate Ray Rice, that the punch was the agent. It doesn't matter if she hit her head on the railing or if she was knocked unconscious by hitting the floor. She was rendered unconscious in the elevator. Janae Palmer at the time was rendered unconscious in the elevator, and that's enough. And the fact that that wasn't seen, I think, kind of shows this, that there was a bubble there in terms of thinking. So I was very heartened to see people like Cynthia Hired and Lisa Friel and a lot of the other, Anna Isaacson and the other women who worked there, because I do think that it was a very much a bubble mentality. They wanted to believe the best of Ray Rice, and they let him talk to them, and they're sympathetic people, they have empathy in their hearts, and they let that kind of cloud, I think, what would have been a more reasoned discipline in that case. It also shows, I think, a lack in the criminal justice system, frankly, when you have prosecutors who saw the inside the elevator tape and didn't bring charges against Ray Rice. They allowed him to enter a pretrial diversionary program that if he clears it, it'll be expunged from his record. So, I mean, I think something that's kind of come to my mind as well is not just, what does the NFL do and what is discipline in that situation, but also, Darren Sharper getting 9 years for 9 rapes in 4 states. Or, Greg Hardy being able to come to a settlement with the alleged victim in a case in North Carolina and avoid a second trial after having been found guilty in a bench trial the first time. So these are things when I'm looking at all this, also I'm looking at the legal system and what it's done. And that's been eye-opening. But I think
I'm going to interrupt you there because the NFL has been very clear they're not going to pay attention to these things like Hardy getting the case dismissed when the complaining witness didn't show up. But then we're critical that they're overreaching and not paying attention to the legal adjudication. So I guess, which is it? Do we want them to respect, okay, Ray Rice only got this, Greg Hardy only got that? Or do we want them to say, we don't care? In our standard, they should be punished severely, regardless of what creative lawyering came up with.
Well, I think Roger Goodell has addressed that by saying it's a privilege to play for the NFL. Whether or not you agree with that, I think, there are many people who don't agree with that. But I think if you have a code of conduct, the standard is not what was the legal penalty, the standard is what happened. And you can say, the NFL now is starting to investigate these cases. Is that going to be flawed? I have a feeling it will be. I have a feeling that there will be cases where it comes out where they make some sort of determination or judgment that is not very popular, and maybe I'm going to be critical of. However, at the same time, I think it's important that they are saying, okay, we're going to actually just try to see what happened. Because it's, the code of conduct violation with Ray Rice is not the legal outcome. The code of conduct violation is when he struck his fiance. So, and especially in cases of violence, whether it's against women, against men, or children, I think the league has an image to protect, and that's not the most important thing in these situations. But certainly, you don't want to have a stereotype of NFL players that they're somehow more violent off the field. because that's not true. Statistically, that's not true, and it's not fair to those players to make those kinds of assumptions. So I think the NFL has to look at these outlying cases like Ray Rice and Greg Hardy and make a stand there, as opposed to, so that it doesn't come back and reflect against the entire, a league full of people who are good citizens, good fathers, good employees. I think that's important.
Ashely, we did a program yesterday, and the underlying theme, and Jane brought up Darren Sharper, who I worked with in Green Bay 6 years, and am shocked as anyone to hear all this. The point is we don't know them. You cover athletes, have covered NFL players for a long time, here in Philly and nationally. Is it easy enough to say we just don't know them? Is that a cop-out? Are they acting as Roger Goodell wants to be the first-class citizens and role modeling? And should they be?
Should they be? I think that's a good question. And I think they should, because as Jane said, it is a privilege to play in that league. And do we know them? No, but it's just as much as like, do I know what you do when you go home? No. Do you know what I do? No.
Pretty boring.
I know, it is. But the thing that's happened in the league that I think is so interesting over the course of the last year is that there have been these high-profile cases. I mean, obviously, Ray Rice is one. I think Darren Sharper has opened up a new, another avenue of having a conversation. Adrian Peterson certainly has. And what it's done now, from what I've heard, is that, the punishment for these things is no longer, it's a 2-game thing. I mean, Adrian Peterson lost all of last season, and the last 6 games he was suspended for, so he lost $4.2 million, I think it was, which is significant. And I think hopefully over time that this will help change behavior and change what guys do, because the NFL has such an enormous platform to affect change. And now it certainly seems for these issues, violence against women, violence against children, like they can use it. And I hope will make a difference.
And Cynthia, we're here in a law school, what we've just talked about with Peterson, with Rice, the NFL has taken its lumps. Arbitrations, going to court, where a judge in Minnesota sends back the Adrian Peterson case, a big loss. But while these lumps have been taken in court, these players we mentioned, Greg Hardy, Adrian Peterson, Ray Rice, didn't play, essentially, in 2014. And some would say, well, that's what the NFL wanted. They didn't want these guys that are committing these acts now out on the football field. Comment on that and this whole idea, which has been hatched in the NFL in the past year, of leave and paid leave and administrative leave. That seems to be, as the cool kids say, a thing right now with NFL discipline.
So I think we're in a little bit of a bubble right now, because the complication around what the league does with player discipline is that we operate under a collective bargaining agreement, right? So talk about complicated legal schemes.
Right.
This adds a layer that makes it difficult sometimes to affect the kind of change quickly that we would like, because everything tends to be litigated. I do think that, as I said, we're in a little bit of this bubble because we have just this small number of cases that we're kind of caught where we have discipline that's occurring after the new personal conduct policy has been adopted, but for conduct that occurred beforehand. Right. So that's a legal complication. Hardy will be the last case like that. So I think going forward, we won't see as much litigation. We won't see kind of as much of this kind of tussle. And, at the league, we had to make a decision. I mean, obviously, we're respectful of judicial decisions. On the other hand, we have adopted this new personal conduct policy unanimously endorsed by the owners. It did a number of important things. First of all, it established that we would not be relying on law enforcement, either for investigation or in terms of what their outcome determinations were. we used to look at those as trying to be somewhat indicative, because we would think the prosecutors, they have all the evidence, they have everything, they have subpoena power. We thought they would have a better insight into the cases than we did, and we just found that wasn't the case necessarily, or that we couldn't necessarily gauge that by the outcome. So personal conduct policy now says we won't do that. We'll do our own investigations. We have our own standards. We're going to try not to wait for law enforcement. Sometimes our hands are a little bit tied because, again, as all you lawyers know here, if you have a criminal justice proceeding, the defendant won't talk to us. Often witnesses won't talk to us. We can't always get our hands on things until the proceedings are done. And that is where a lot of the best evidence resides. So, we have these complications, but I think that what we've tried to do a little bit is to cut through them and say, especially going forward, our standards are crystal clear. They're clear to every club owner. They're clear to every team management. They're clear to every player. They're clear to every employee in the league. And the process by which we will investigate allegations of misconduct is now also clear. We've just hired 2 special counsel, Todd Jones, who's an amazing federal law enforcement figure and leader from the last several decades, and Lisa Frio, who's a fantastic investigator. And the level of professionalism that they will bring to this process, I just think it's going to be outstanding, and I think it's going to really be state of the art in terms of what a private employer can do. So we'll have to work through these kind of bumps as we get this underway, but I actually think it's going to smooth out, and I think that we'll be able to, to reach out to the union and hopefully have a little bit smoother going forward.
Can I just add something to that?
Sure,
I think it's important in the Greg Hardy case. The NFL actually filed a motion to unseal the exhibits in the first trial there, and was successful in doing so. And I think people could be uncomfortable with the idea of an employer going that far to find out information in a situation. So I'm not saying that that's necessarily, the greatest thing, or that's not going to have some sort of controversial element attached to it. However, it does show that there is certainly a new push to get at the facts and the truth.
And Cynthia, how will you interface with some of the people you mentioned on the investigative front either, or I know your primary role is government affairs in D.C., and everyone else is based in New York. So tell me how you interface on that level.
Well, I think I'm not directly responsible for discipline matters. That is something that's something that is focused by the lawyers in New York, as well as these 2 special counsel now really will run that process. But I talk to them frequently. I give them my perspective as someone who has worked also around law enforcement, criminal justice, public policy issues. And I feel that I can, just help them in a way get that broader perspective. I think what we saw at the league is that we had people who ran football, and they looked at discipline issues under the collective bargaining agreement and as an employment matter. And on the one hand, maybe that's a fair way to do it, and I think we will get some criticism for doing it a different way. But I think that the commissioner feels that because of the role that the NFL plays, because of the high profile, because we're role models to kids across the country, we have to do it differently, and we have to take on a really higher standard than what at many employers would probably be acceptable.
Can I add something to
Ashely,
that?
yeah.
No, and I think where you'll see it change, we were talking before coming up here, one of the most troubling things that the league did, I think, during the Ray Rice investigation that they did, they had Ray and his fiancée, Janae Palmer, come up to the league office to meet with Roger Goodell and Jeff Pash, their lead attorney. I believe Ozzie Newsome, the Ravens general manager, was there. John Harbaugh might have even been there, the Ravens coach. And they had Janae, who was the victim in all of this, meet with all of them in front of Ray, with no other female in the room, which is, so she's in front of the man who beat her, his employer, and the most powerful man in all of sports, and she's supposed to give her account accurately, which I think is just a travesty that they did that to her. And so hopefully, at this point now, with Cynthia and with the people who are in place, that won't happen again, because that should not have happened in that. I mean, I just didn't think that was fair to her at all.
It was a perfect example of where the league was treating this as an employment issue, right? And that's kind of a classic thing in an employment issue. If someone wants to bring their family in to talk about a situation, the attitude from the union and the employer is that should happen. I think, again, the problem is that there wasn't enough understanding around this behavior. Now we have very professional law enforcement experienced people running this process, and we would have, I think, a much different approach.
And that hopefully is progress and something positive to come out of that whole situation.
Well, Lisa Friel, who's now going to be in charge of investigations, is a former sex crimes prosecutor in Manhattan. So, I mean, that's just it's a level of expertise that simply was not available to the league before.
And your background, Cynthia, as you mentioned briefly and modestly, the putting together, working on the Violence Against Women Act, when you did that, how much of what you did, 20-something years ago, is like replaying with what the NFL's gone through this past 6 months?
Well, I think what my experience gave me was an appreciation that this behavior is complicated. It is something, it's not black and white. Like there's a lot of counterintuitive behavior that goes on around family violence. And as I said, I've never worked in the field, but I've heard enough from people to understand you have a victim who is also perhaps in love with the person who victimized her, perhaps married, perhaps having children. There's emotional dependence, there's financial dependence. These are complicated situations. It's not like stranger violence. And so you have behavior around this type of crime that you don't see in crime involving strangers. And if you don't know that, and you see someone come in and say, oh, it's fine, right? You don't know really how to gauge that. And so I think that having people like Lisa, who have an unbelievable amount of experience with this type of crime, having me who has the experience from the policy level, I think we have just been able to educate people involved in the discipline at the league around some of the nuance and the complexities, and to alert them that there may be other issues like that. So when the Peterson thing came up, we said we need to have people in here who understand child abuse, right, and can help us understand the behavior here. And whatever it is, you need to have the right people in the room. And I think that broader lesson has been something that the league has paid a lot of attention to.
And Jane, you mentioned the first video back in February, a year ago, more than a year ago. And I think people were tweeting out and talking, maybe you were one of them, that said, what do you think domestic violence looks like? Right. After the first and or second video. So this is kind of the hard question with Cynthia sitting here, without the videos. What do you think the NFL would have been doing this past 8 months?
I think it's 2 games, and I don't think anybody cares. I don't think you have an outcry at all. I mean, the fact of the matter is that as a sporting public, we've been seeing things like this for years and shrugging our shoulders. You think of Terrell Suggs in Baltimore and the allegations against him many years ago that he poured bleach in his wife's face. And that's, like I said, an allegation. But I mean, these are things that people were like, oh, well. But the video changes everything, right? The pictures change everything. We see that in South Carolina, with a man being shot in the back as he ran away, and how that's, now created an outcry around that issue. Whereas if you just have the word of the police officer in that situation, you don't have, people aren't as passionate about it. It takes those images hit us in a way that hearing a story simply doesn't. We tend to filter things that we hear through our own whatever bubble we live in, and the ideas of things that we might have about it. And in this case, those ideas are often that women are gold diggers, or that they are lying, or that they have an agenda. And I think when you actually see it, though, you can't have those misconceptions.
Well, and I mean, look at the facts. I mean, Ray Rice is still unemployed, and Greg Hardy is not. What if there was video of what Greg Hardy allegedly did to the woman in Charlotte? I mean, would the Dallas Cowboys have been so eager to sign them so that he could help their defense? I mean, I would think probably not. So, as Jane said, the videos and pictures, they were a game changer.
And
I think can I just add
yeah,
something?
sure.
I think about the, I don't think I would ever be comfortable saying people don't deserve second chances, even in situations like that where we see egregious violence. And I don't think the NFL is saying that. I mean, they're saying a 6-month penalty for the first finding.
Six
game,
yeah.
excuse me. 6 game, and then an indefinite suspension afterwards, or potential indefinite suspension afterwards. I mean, I think, you want to understand also that this is not a one and done, and that people are people, and that there are people in the league, for example, Michael Vick, who have had have done terrible things and have emerged to be somewhat different. At least that's my understanding, having covered him for a year, even though you can never know somebody or vouch for somebody fully, but certainly has changed things and has done, some work with the Humane Society and with animal shelters. And so I think we want to be careful in making sure that we're not condemning people forever also.
And Ashely, I mean, this is kind of an obvious question, but this misbehavior has been going on for 50 years, right? Is that right? Or is it just the media attention? It's always been going on, right? It's just, as we talk about now with cell phone video and elevator video, that's the game changer. So I guess my question is, are we ascribing too much negativity to today's athletes, knowing this has been going on, just never covered with the saturated media that we have?
Well, we just live in a different time now, and it has been going on forever. I mean, there's cases in the NFL of domestic violence goes back, years and years and years. But there wasn't Twitter and Instagram, 10 years ago or 15 years ago, certainly to chronicle all of it. And so I think it's definitely changed. And the one thing that hasn't changed is that the NFL is a money-making behemoth machine that relies on players to, talented players to help make money. And so I think that's why I'm with you. I think that everyone deserves a second chance. And I had a front row seat in Philly when the Eagles brought Michael Vick back and watched that whole thing transpire. And I think he certainly deserved a second chance. I think everyone deserves a second chance for the most part. But the league certainly believes that because, they need the talent to, fill the roster spots and to generate the interest and fill the stadiums and, get the TV ratings up.
But I also think that the perspective that we have at the league is that while, of course, our core function is to put on football games and therefore to deal with disciplining our own employees, whether they're players or not, the way I look at this from my public policy background is that we have this opportunity, because of the platform the league has, really to go beyond that, right? I mean, domestic violence is not something that just occurs in the NFL or in sports. It's a huge societal problem. What I saw from working in criminal justice in the federal government is that so much crime is related to domestic violence. 40% of mass shootings, right? I mean, it's just an unbelievable driver of criminal behavior. So it's not an athlete problem, it's not an NFL problem only. But because of the attention that's given to athletes, because of the huge attention that's given to the NFL, that gives us, we believe, a responsibility and an opportunity to turn this back to say, we need to deal with this. So when we look at disciplining people, we can say, well, we could have adopted this, quote, zero tolerance policy, right? One strike, you're out. We're not going to do anything with you. But it was actually all of the groups in the field who came to us and said, don't do that. Because if you cut ties, you don't have an ability to get someone into counseling. You don't have an ability to help the family with the support that they need. This is the only way you can actually rehabilitate someone and make a difference in the family's lives as well as more broadly. So what we're trying to do is to say, in the course of our discipline, it's not a matter of just 6 games or 8 games or 10 games. It's also a matter of what is the individual doing to say, I'm going to get help. I am going to learn to do my life in a different way, and send that broader message that it's not a matter of just being punished and coming back different. Like, you have to do the work to be different. You have to learn about your own behavior. You have to get help around your own behavior. And I think that's a big part of what's new about our discipline.
And also that the programs that are being taken to the teams, the anti-domestic violence, anti-sexual assault training that's being administered to teams now. And that is also, there are lots of colleges and high schools now that are requesting that, and the NFL made that PowerPoint public. But there's also training that's being done to help people who may be in crisis before it gets to the point that there's actual violence occurring. I mean, I think the NFL, and you can be very cynical and say, well, this is just a PR stunt. They want to look better. They're trying to make it go away, so they put together a PowerPoint, and that's that. But the educational aspect is actually where real change could happen down the line. And it's something that's not going to make a headline. It's kind of, people have moved on in a lot of respects from the story, but I think it might be one of the most important parts of this entire story.
And I think, real quickly, I think so much gets lost in the league level. Having been on the team level, it just resonates. I always think of this story, and I'll tell it real quickly and get your reaction. We were thinking of bringing in, I was at Green Bay, we were thinking of bringing in a defensive tackle. Defensive tackles are always squirreliest. This guy had a rap sheet a block long, and domestic assault, and violence, and sexual assault, and drunk and disorderly. And I was with a coach and a scout, and I said, there's no way in God's green earth we can bring in this guy. And they said, Andrew, what do you think we're asking him to do here? I said, what do you mean? What do you think we're asking him to do? I said, what do you mean? He said, well, we want him to get into 75 street fights and win them. I don't care about this rap sheet. That helps. Anyway, I won that war. I won that battle, lost a war with a bigger problem.
All right, I have to jump in for just a minute, and I'm going to channel Troy Vincent, right, who is a wonderful colleague of mine at the league, a former player. He actually very much disagrees with that attitude. I'm sure there are coaches and managers who have that view. He says, thousands and thousands of us play football. We turn it on the field. We turn it off when we leave. Don't tar all of us by saying, if you play football, you must be a violent guy, because he would be the first person to say this is not true. And that, we've got bad apples, and you got to get rid of the bad apples. But and I'm not saying football isn't aggressive and a contact sport and all that kind of stuff, but it's not the same as committing violent criminal acts. It's just, there's a difference.
But a few maybe can't turn it off. Maybe there are a few that can't turn it off.
You have to guard against those few, absolutely.
Right.
This is where I think that the league is actually in conflict with NFL teams, because it's still in the NFL team's best interest to bring in those guys so that they can play, even as the NFL is sending out a different message that it won't tolerate that kind of behavior.
Well, that gets into whether the league would take an incredibly additional step of
So I think
getting involved in personnel decisions.
I think there is club accountability that people aren't focusing on. I think when you are paying a player and he's not playing, you're paying millions and millions of dollars, that hurts you. It counts against the salary cap, right? So I think that there are disincentives, but I do think that it will be a work in progress. And I think that we will see as this, becomes part of the culture, what needs to be done to make sure that it's taken seriously. One of the opportunities I think the NFL has missed is working closer with the NFLPA, and I understand that the NFL's point of view is going to be that they didn't want to work with us, and the PA is going to say, well, the NFL won't work with us. But at the same time, I think that if you could get both of those organizations to pull together on this issue, that it would better serve both the NFL and the PA. So, as you all know, I work in Washington, so I'm really used to people who can't get along and can't find compromise, and I think it's a huge missed opportunity. I have to say, in this particular area, we had a real disagreement with the union that we couldn't bridge. It wasn't that we didn't want to work with them or consult them. We consulted them constantly throughout revising the personal conduct policy. But their perspective was, and I understand it as a union perspective, they didn't want players off the field until the criminal justice system had gone all the way through the appeal level. commissioner was simply not willing to do that. So there we had a real dispute that we couldn't bridge. But generally, we should be working hand in glove with the union on a host of issues, and I hope I can help that.
Breaking news.
As with a lot of these panels, this one could go on all day. Let's give a warm appreciation to Jane, Cynthia, Ashely.